Hello everyone, this is R.S. Miller at the endtimenews.org and today is October 11th, 2013. Fukushima radiation levels hit a 2-year high. Seawater just outside one of Japan's damaged Fukushima Daiichi reactors registered radiation levels on Wednesday 13 times the previous day's reading, the operator of the crippled nuclear plant said on Thursday. Japan's Tokyo Electric Power Company, TEPCO, said combined cesium-134 and cesium-137 readings just outside the damaged number 2 reactor jumped to 1,200 becquerels per liter on Wednesday, the highest levels recorded since late 2011. The regulatory limits for cesium, which emits powerful gamma radiation and is potentially fatal for humans, is 90 becquerels per liter for cesium-137 and 60 becquerels per liter for cesium-134. A TEPCO spokesman said the sudden spike in radiation was caused by construction work near the number 2 building, Reuters reported. News of the spike in radiation levels is the latest setback this week for TEPCO, which has been harshly criticized for its handling of the nuclear disaster in the wake of the massive quake and tsunami that hit the power station in March 2011, triggering 3 reactor meltdowns. On Wednesday, 6 workers were exposed to radiation after a pipe connected to the contaminated water treatment system was mistakenly detached. Reuters estimates that at least 7 tons of water escaped the system. Earlier, a worker accidentally switched off a water pump used to channel water into the reactor building. Crews are using chemicals to fortify the soil around the Fukushima reactor buildings, hundreds of meters from the port entrance that connects to the Pacific Ocean, to prevent contaminated water from flowing into the ocean. The pressure from injecting chemicals into the ground forced contaminated soil out into the port area, the spokesman said. TEPCO also said cesium-137 readings just outside the silt fence next to the number 2 reactor increased to 160 becquerels per liter, at a number that exceeds the regulatory limit and almost double the previous day's reading. Radiation from radioactive water leaking from the plant is mostly confined to the harbor around the facility, officials have said. TEPCO, which is using hundreds of tons of water in an effort to keep the reactors from overheating, has struggled to contain the buildup of radioactive water at the plant. The accidents at the Fukushima Daiichi plant, situated 220 kilometers from Tokyo, are fueling doubts over TEPCO's ability to oversee a hugely complicated cleanup that is expected to take decades. Last week, the beleaguered Japanese energy company said 430 liters, which is 113 gallons, of contaminated water had leaked from a storage tank at Fukushima and probably flowed into the ocean. Meanwhile, Japanese officials have said there is no environmental threat to other countries as radiation will be diluted by the sea. Iran dismisses closure of Fordo nuclear site. Chairman of the Iranian Parliament's National Security and Foreign Policy Commission, Alaeddin Borojardi, strongly rejected Western media reports claiming that Tehran plans to raise a proposal during the upcoming talks with the 6 world powers on the closure of its Fordo uranium enrichment facility in return for the annulment of sanctions. It is an irrelative word. Fordo will never be closed and will continue to work, Borojardi said in a meeting with the Secretary of State at the Swiss Foreign Ministry, Yves Rosier, in Tehran on Wednesday. We in the parliament will not allow such a thing to happen, he added. In relevant remarks on Monday, a senior Iranian legislator said Fordo underground facility near the city of Qom, where Iran enriches 20% grade uranium, is in full operation. The centrifuges at Fordo have been installed completely and the facility is in full operation and without any problem or deficiency, a member of the Parliament's National Security and Foreign Policy Commission stated. The 20% enrichment is undergone at the site, Fordo, he added. Fordo enrichment facility hosts Iran's uranium enrichment to the purity level of 20%, which is needed for fueling a research reactor in Tehran which produces radioisotopes for medical purposes. The U.S. withholds military aid to Egypt. The U.S. is reducing its military aid to Egypt following the ouster of President Mohamed Morsi and the subsequent crackdown on his supporters by the military-backed government. The U.S. provides $1.5 billion in aid each year to Egypt, while the State Department did not provide the total amount of the aid being cut. It amounts to hundreds of millions in mostly military aid. The U.S. has put a hold on delivering tanks and fighter jets to Egypt, officials said Wednesday in an apparent show of Washington's disapproval of a violent crackdown on protesters by the Egyptian military. State Department spokeswoman Jen Psaki said the U.S. would withhold delivery of certain large-scale military systems as well as cash assistance to the Egyptian government until credible progress is made towards an inclusive civilian government set up through fair and free elections. The United States wants to see Egypt succeed, and we believe the U.S.-Egypt partnership will be strongest when Egypt is represented by an inclusive, democratically elected civilian government based on the rule of law, fundamental freedoms, and an open and competitive economy, Psaki said in the statement. Meanwhile, deposed President Morsi is scheduled to stand trial on November the 4th. The trial of Egypt's deposed President Mohamed Morsi on charges of inciting to murder of protesters will start on November 4th, the official MENA news agency reported. Morsi will stand trial with 14 other defendants over the killing of protesters outside his presidential palace in December 2012, almost 6 months before his overthrow in a military coup. 2 Israeli soldiers injured by Syrian mortar fire. 2 Israeli soldiers were slightly wounded by cross-border fire in the Golan Heights facing Syria. A mortar shell exploded in the northern Golan Heights. It is not known whether the attack was spillover from the ongoing Syrian civil war or intentional. According to preliminary reports, one of the soldiers was injured from shrapnel fragments and the other had suffered from shock as a result of a fall. Both soldiers were initially treated for their moderate wounds at the scene by Magen David Adom medics. However, the pair will be further treated at a nearby hospital. Last week, Defense Minister Moshe Ya'alon spoke to reporters about border incidents with Syria after visiting a paratroopers brigade training exercise in the Golan Heights. Ya'alon said there had been frequent incidents of spillover from internal Syrian fighting on Israel's Golan Heights border and clarified IDF protocol. If we are able to locate the source of gunfire from Syria, we will destroy it, Ya'alon told reporters. He added that there was no change in policy and the Israeli position. More chemical weapons inspectors arrive in Syria. A second team of international chemical weapons inspectors has joined the mission already in Syria as part of an agreement to eliminate the Syrian chemical arms. The group includes inspectors from the Organization of the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons and the United Nations. Earlier in the day, a spokesman for the team said the inspectors had so far visited 3 sites across Syria. Meanwhile, the Syrian government says that a ceasefire should be put in place between the foreign-backed militants operating in the country and the Syrian army in order for the inspectors to be able to access some of the sites. Reports say that 27 inspectors are scheduled to visit more than 20 different sites. The sites reportedly include areas held by the militants. Palestinian terrorists prefer violence over peace. IDF Colonel murdered at his home. Israel's minister in charge of housing said he would bolster settlement building in the Jordan Valley area Friday in the wake of an apparent terror attack the night before in which a retired IDF colonel was killed. Housing and Construction Minister Uri Ariel from the Nationalist Jewish Home Party said in a statement Friday morning he would work to enlarge and strengthen settlement in the area where Syria Ofer, age 50, was killed early Friday morning. The murder occurred at about 1 a.m. at the Brosh Habika vacation village where Ofer and his wife Monique Moore were living. Syria, who was a colonel in the Israeli Defense Force Reserves, was attacked by two Palestinians outside his home. Stepping out of the house to investigate a suspicious sound, he was beaten to death with axes and iron bars as he struggled against his assailants. After phoning for help, his wife Monique fled the house chased by the terrorists until she stopped a passing car and summoned security forces to the scene. She was hurt as she ran and taken to the hospital. Paramedics reached Colonel Ofer too late to save his life. Large army, police, and Shin Bet reinforcements poured into the Jordan Valley to hunt for the attackers and set up roadblocks. Security forces have arrested 5 Palestinian Authority Arab men on suspicion of carrying out the brutal attack on Friday morning. Some 3 weeks ago, IDF Staff Sergeant Gabriel Kobe, age 20, was killed while manning his post near the entrance to the tomb of the patriarchs in Hebron. Kobe was shot by a sniper's bullet fired from a distance. 6 days ago, another sniper's bullet found its way to Noam Glick, a 9-year-old Israeli girl who was seriously injured by the Palestinian gunmen in Saget near Ramallah. Fortunately, she will recover. In the news today, we're hearing a lot of talk about a two-state solution between the Palestinians and Israel. A two-state solution to the ongoing Palestinian-Israeli conflict in the Middle East is not the answer. There will never be a meaningful and lasting peace. The efforts of the international community and others to bring about peace and stability in the region will not only fail in its endeavors, but will also be partly responsible for the upcoming World War III. The predominant belief by many Western nations, as well as others, that a two-state solution with Israel and Palestine living side by side in peace and harmony is a completely irrational fallacy. Having a mortal enemy on the nearly indefensible borders of Israel is not a recipe for peace. Add in the fact that this enemy, its government, and a significant portion of its people have absolutely no desire for peace with Israel, but instead seeks the total annihilation of the nation along with the deaths of the Jewish people in the region, and if not in the world. Unfortunately, far too many people buy into the myth that there can indeed be a two-state solution. Back in 2012, even Stevie Wonder, the well-known music legend, canceled a scheduled concert he had, for a particular time, which would have benefited the Friends of Israel Defense Force. The FIDF was established in 1981 by a group of Holocaust survivors to provide for the well-being of the men and women who serve in the IDF, as well as the families of fallen soldiers. Mr. Wonder made the following statement after being urged by the United Nations to cancel the concert due to the sensitivities over the UN's recent recognition of the State of Palestine as a non-member observer nation and the ratcheting up of tensions between Israel and the Palestinians. Apparently, showing support for Israel, the IDF, Israeli fallen soldiers and their families, is not the politically correct thing to do. In a notification sent to Reuters by Stevie's spokesperson, he said, "Given the current and the very delicate situation in the Middle East, and with a heart that has always cried out for world unity, I will not be performing at the FIDF Gala. Personally, I can appreciate anyone's effort and desire for world peace. However, acquiescing to the request of those who side with terrorist organizations is not the way to go about it. If the leaders of the Arab world and Palestine would acknowledge Israel's right to exist and the rights of the Jewish people to live in Israel, then and only then would a two-state solution be even remotely possible. But as it stands now, the Arabs are not interested in the world's proposals and attempted implementation of a side-by-side coexistence of the two very differing peoples. What they want instead of a state called Palestine alongside of Israel is a state called Palestine in place of Israel. But in order to get a better understanding of this never-ending conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, one must first understand a little of the history of these two peoples. Although their rivalry goes back literally thousands of years, we will begin only as far back as 1946. In 1946, at the first post-war Zionist Congress in Basel, David Ben-Gurion assumed the defense portfolio, including responsibility for the Haganah, which is the Jewish paramilitary underground, which at the time concentrated on the struggle against the British. Although British restrictions, searches, and detentions made the building of a clandestine force with armor and artillery, air and sea power almost impossible, Ben-Gurion decided early on that this was the decisive task: to build up a force in preparation for an assault by the regular armies of the Arab countries, which the Yishuv would have to face alone without outside help. He found the Haganah woefully ill-prepared for such an eventuality and set about energetically to rectify this. Since import and deployment of heavy weapons were not practical as long as the British held sway over Palestine, it was decided that manpower should be readied in the country and equipment purchased abroad to be married in time to throw back an Arab assault, if not prevent it, in time for May 15, 1948, the day envisaged for the termination of the British Mandate and the day after Israel would declare its independence. During the Israeli War of Independence in 1947 through 1949, the war was fought along the entire lengthwise border of the country. Israel fought against Lebanon and Syria in the north, Iraq and Transjordan, which was renamed Jordan during the war, in the east, Egypt along with contingents from the Sudan in the south, and Palestinians and volunteers from Arab countries in the interior of the country. It was the bloodiest of Israel's wars. 6,373 were killed in action from its pre-state days until July of 1949, which was almost 1% of the Jewish community known as the Yishuv, although the figure includes quite a number of new immigrants and some foreign volunteers as well. In the first phase, November 29, 1947 through April 1, 1948, it was the Palestinian Arabs who took the offensive. With the help of volunteers from neighboring countries, the Yishuv had little success in limiting the war, suffering severe casualties and disruption of passage along most of the major highways. In the second phase, April 1st through May 15th, the Haganah took the initiative and in 6 weeks was able to turn the tables, capturing the Arab sections of Tiberias, Haifa, and later also Safed and Acre, temporarily opening the road to Jerusalem and gaining control of much of the territory allotted to the Jewish state under the UN resolution. The third phase, May 15th through July 19th, considered the critical one, opened with the simultaneous coordinated assault of the fledgling state by 5 regular Arab armies from neighboring countries, with an overwhelming superiority of heavy equipment, armor, artillery, and air force. On May 31st, the Haganah was renamed to the Israeli Defense Forces. The IDF suffered initial setbacks, including the loss of the Et Zion block in Judea, the area of Mishmar Hayarden in the north, and Yad Mordechai in the south, but after 3 weeks was able to halt the offensive, to stabilize the front, and even initiate some local offensive operations. The fourth phase, July 1948 through July 1949, was characterized by Israeli initiatives. Operation Yahav in October cleared the road to the Negev, culminating in the capture of Beersheba. Operation Haram at the end of October resulted in the capture of the Upper Galilee. Operation Horev in December of 48, and Operation Yuvda in March of 1949 completed the capture of the Negev, which had been allotted to the Jewish state by the United Nations. Simultaneously, the Arab countries signed armistice agreements. First came Egypt in 1949, February, followed by Lebanon in March, Jordan in April, and Syria in July. Iraq was the only one not to sign the armistice agreement with Israel. It preferred to withdraw its troops and hand over its sector to the Arab Legion of Jordan. In the end, Israel not only ejected the invading Arab forces, it also captured and held some 5,000 kilometers over and above the areas allocated to it by the United Nations. Since then, there have been numerous wars, conflicts, and terrorist attacks. In 1956, the Sinai Campaign fought to put an end to terrorist incursions into Israel and to remove the Egyptian blockade in Elliot. In 1965, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or PLO for short, was recognized with its principal military arm, Fatah, an array of paramilitary and terrorist organizations. The PLO began operations on the 1st of January 1965, at first from across the Lebanese border. Although it has never been considered an existential threat to Israel, it was a constant nuisance and a diversion from the main task, preparations for yet another round of war. In an air battle in which Syria, Russia's closest ally in the Middle East, lost 13 planes, provided the opening bell. As a result of Soviet prodding, Gamal Abdel Nasser Hussein, Egypt's second president from 1956 until his death in 1970, deployed 100,000 troops to the Sinai region. He demanded that the Secretary General of the United Nations withdraws its UN emergency forces, which had been placed there by agreement in order to keep the peace. The UN Secretary General promptly withdrew UNEF from the Sinai without contesting Hussein's demands. Then Nasser announced the closing of the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping in May. The world powers' vague promises did absolutely nothing to reopen the straits, and Israel made the decision to go it alone. On June 5, 1967, Israeli Air Force launched a surprise attack which left the Egyptian Air Force in tatters. Within the brief span of 6 days, the IDF overran the whole Sinai Peninsula up to the Suez Canal, took the entire west bank of the River Jordan, and in the last days of the war, captured a large part of the Golan Heights, including the dominant vantage point of Mount Hermon, and culminating in the capture of the old city of Jerusalem and the Western Wall, which is known to many as the Wailing Wall. Then there was the War of Attrition, fought from 1968 through 1970, the Yom Kippur War in 1973, a war which started on the holiest day in the Jewish calendar, the Day of Atonement, and was the fiercest Arab-Israeli war since the 1948 War of Independence. Egypt and Syria attacked Israel, catching them completely off guard. The Lebanon War in 1982, Operation Peace for Galilee, a ceasefire with Palestinian terrorists in Lebanon declared in July 1981 was broken. The terrorists continued to carry out attacks against Israeli targets in Israel and abroad, and the threat to the northern settlements became unbearable. On June 6, 1982, the IDF launched Operation Peace for Galilee. During the 1991 U.S.-led Gulf War against Iraq, Saddam Hussein threatened to attack Israel with various types of weapons, including non-conventional ordnance. For the first time in Israel's history, the entire country faced the very real threat of destruction. Then on July 12, 2006, 8 IDF soldiers were killed and 2 kidnapped on the border with Lebanon in an attack by Hezbollah, the terrorist organization in southern Lebanon. The attack by Hezbollah ignited the 2006 Lebanon War. Its ceasefire called for the disarmament of Hezbollah and the remaining armed camps of the PLO, and for Lebanon to take control of southern border militarily for the first time in 4 decades. Hostilities were suspended as of September 8, 2006, and as of 2012, Hezbollah has still not disarmed and most likely never will as long as the State of Israel exists. But even in the light of these open hostilities and flagrant violations of agreements by Hezbollah, Israel on June 18, 2008, declared that it was open to peace talks with Lebanon. Now moving ahead to November 2012, Israel launched massive air assaults on selected targets in Gaza after Hamas's refusal to quit launching rockets and mortars across the border into Israel, as well as attacks on Israeli IDF members patrolling the Gaza-Israeli border region. Unlike Israel, which made every effort to minimize collateral damage and the killing of civilians, Hamas, on the other hand, intentionally targeted children and civilians in their attacks, launching missiles aimed at schools, buses, and playgrounds. It should be a well-known fact that on multiple occasions, Israel has acted against its own best interest by attempting to make peace with an enemy who has sworn to destroy the nation and the Jewish people. One such self-defeating effort was known as the Oslo Accords. According to the process, Take 2. It should be a well-known fact that on multiple occasions, Israel has acted against its own best interest by attempting to make peace with an enemy who has sworn to destroy the nation and the Jewish people. One such self-defeating effort was known as the Oslo Accords. The process began in January 1993 in a meeting with 2 Israeli and 2 Palestinian representatives through Norwegian mediators. From its early stages, both parties spoke of an Israeli withdrawal from Gaza. Shimon Peres, Foreign Minister for Israel, and Johan Jorgen Holst, Foreign Minister for Norway, reported to U.S. President Bill Clinton regarding the progress of the talks, and in September of 1993, the Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and the PLO leader Yasser Arafat signed the Declaration of Principles in the White House in Washington under the Clinton administration. The signing of the declaration had dramatic consequences for the policy of Israel towards the PLO. Israel acknowledged the PLO as the representative of the Palestinian people and announced its intent to begin negotiations as part of a comprehensive peace process in the Middle East. Arafat, in the name of the PLO, acknowledged Israel's right for a safe and peaceful existence. Arafat committed himself to the peace process and to work towards a peaceful solution to the conflict. He obliged to abstain from the use of terror and violent acts. He acknowledged the United Nations Security Council resolutions number 242 and 338, and had agreed to approve the necessary changes in the Palestinian Manifest of the Palestinian National Council, which mainly concerned chapters contradicting the declaration of disapproving of Israel's right for independence. Part of the agreement was that Israel would withdraw all of its military forces from Gaza, as well as resettle Jewish residents to other locations within Israel. In other words, no Jews in Gaza. Subsequently, in August 2005, this plan became a reality, but still no peace. Just the existence of Jews in Israel are grounds for no peace. The Arabs will never accept Jews in what they perceive as Palestine. A small Palestinian state alongside of their most hated enemy, Israel, will never do, and they will never stop fighting for the entirety of the land. In November 1967, after months of deliberations, the Security Council unanimously adopted Resolution number 242, calling for peace and recognition of the right of every nation to live free from threat within secure and recognized boundaries. However, the Arab League, in its session in Sudan 1967, adopted a different resolution. The 3 no's of Khartoum: no peace, no negotiations, no recognition of Israel. Although the 3 no's resolution of Khartoum took place back in 1967, little has changed since then. Saying no to Israel is a fundamental ideology which doesn't even recognize their right to exist. And if their right to exist is not recognized, then any sort of lasting peace is merely a pipe dream. I know that I've painted a picture of gloom and doom, and although there is in fact a war coming which will result in the deaths of several billion people, there is also some good news as well. During these last days events, Jesus Christ will return and set up his kingdom, establishing a lasting, permanent peace, and will put a stop to those who are destroying the earth. And at the end of the Great Tribulation period and the 1,000-year millennial reign, God will set up a new heaven and a new earth, and we will have peace for all eternity. In the book of Revelation, chapter 21, John the Revelator said, "And I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away. Also there was no more sea. Then I, John, saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from heaven saying, Behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and he will dwell with them, and they shall be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. And God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There shall be no more death, nor sorrow, nor crying, and there shall be no more pain, for the former things have passed away. Then he who sat on the throne said, Behold, I will make all things new. And he said to me, Write, for these words are true and faithful. And he said to me, It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. I will give of the fountain of the water of life freely to him who thirsts. He who overcomes shall inherit all things, and I will be his God, and he shall be my son. but the cowardly, unbelieving, abominable, murderers, sexually immoral, sorcerers, idolaters, and all liars shall have their part in the lake which burns with fire and brimstone, which is the second death. Are you saved? Follow the link in the box below and pray the prayer of salvation with a sincere heart, and you will be saved. It is my prayer that God bless each and every one of you with ears to hear, eyes to see, and a heart to receive. In Jesus' name, amen.